Greetings from the underworld. This is your host, Carl Cactus Wormuth, and you're listening to Thinker Stinker, where guests pick one film that makes them think and one they say stinks. Today's thinker is Pigeon, the 2014 Swedish absurdist comedy film directed by Roy Andersson. The stinker is the 2019 music rom-com Yesterday. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy. I'd like to welcome Mark Eliasof. How's it going, Mark?
Good, Carl. How you doing, man?
I'm good. So your thinker was Roy Andersson's A Pigeon Sat on a Branch Reflecting on Existence, a mouthful of a title, but a great film.
Yeah, a terrific film. And it is hard to give that title to anybody to tell them to go watch it. I just say, look for Pigeon. Look for the film Pigeon.
Yeah, no, I have quite a few friends who are, in general, very open-minded to watching new films, but that title is discouraging. But anyway, how'd you come across Roy Andersson?
My wife and I attend the Palm Springs International Film Festival most years, and we have a lot of fun. You know, you get to watch films all day long. You can't beat that. You know, one of the things they have in Palm Springs is this little newspaper that gives you the schedule of all the films, and it gives you about a paragraph and a half on each film about what it's about. So if you read an interesting paragraph, you say, okay, this is something I'd like to, go check out. And I saw You, the Living, which is the second of his Living trilogy films. I saw that film and I was just completely blown away. We were traveling at the time with a film critic that was running a trip to the film festival. It's really cool. He'd have a director or an actor show up at breakfast with us. And it's a really interesting way to do the trip. But anyway, I kept talking about how brilliant Roy Andersson was, and he thought I was a little bit nuts. And I spent the next couple of years pushing him. And then the next time his next film was playing Pigeon at the film festival, we happened to be traveling with a different film group. Our friends that we had met were going with this other film group, and they said, come with us this year. And we tried it one year. And that guy was a smart industry guy in film, but not an aesthetic guy. And I said, the Pigeon's playing. You got to see Pigeon. And like he said to me, yeah, I know about that film. It's weird. If you explain to me what it's about, maybe I'll go see it. And it was like, I knew right then I was not going to travel to that film festival with that guy again. So now we do the festival on our own. And last year, not last year, but 2019, right before the pandemic, I was able to see About Endlessness at that film festival. I'm dying for that to become accessible so I can see it again. I literally check every week to see if it's going to stream or if it's selling as a DVD. I really want to see that one again so much.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's not just that the content is inaccessible to the masses, but it's actually hard to get your hands on these movies. I remember I saw Pigeon a few years ago because it was streaming, and it's still streaming. But the other two parts of the trilogy took me a while. I think I got one on Canopy eventually. But anyway, You, the Living, the middle one that you mentioned, is my favorite of the three. Because it's got that great, first of all, it's got this great rock and roll guitar plot. And it has this insane sequence where a house is moving through a city and they're just watching everybody pass by. And I don't know, that to me, of all the vignettes in the trilogy, is my favorite.
Well, that scene is like they're in their house and it's on a train track. It's especially amazing, which we can talk about, but Roy Andersson doesn't use locations generally. He builds sets for all these things and spends mammoth amounts of money getting the visuals exactly right. So that's particularly amazing. In fact, I don't know if you got to see You, the Living on DVD, but in the extras that come with the DVD, you see how they did that. And it's incredible. It's really amazing.
Yeah, when I first came across Roy Andersson, I really thought he was incomparable. Like, there was nobody like him. And now that I've dived more into European filmmakers, there are some people that he's like. And you're talking about like the huge set constructions. He really reminds me of Jacques Tati, who he has referenced in interviews, especially Playtime, because that's got the same kind of slapstick. It's a little less absurdist. It's the same type of slapstick humor. And with like putting the artistic vision before any kind of practical filmmaking reality. It's all about whatever I have to do to make this work. And I think the content shows that too, because most people seeing movies want a lot of motion, and almost all of his shots are stationary.
Yeah, well, we'll talk more about that in a second, but, it reminded me of another filmmaker too, which is one of my favorite films of the 70s was a film by Louis Buñuel, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And he had another one that was a follow-up that was similar called The Phantom of Liberty. But Discreet Charm is, it's this group of upper crust people trying to have a dinner, and all these bizarre things come to interrupt the meal over and over and over, and they try another day, and then they go a thing, and then it's a theater, and then it's a dream sequence, and it reminds me a lot of the way Roy Andersson links what seem like unrelated anecdotal scenes together. That reminds me of that director also sometimes.
Yeah, he reminds me of Buñuel also in that his career has really different junctures. I mean, there's like the commercial era. There's his 70s feature films that are closer to like Bicycle Thieves, which he listed as, well, he talks about his neo-realist, his Italian neo-realist influence a lot. Obviously, Buñuel has his start with Dali and then moves into his work in Mexico, which is probably my favorite of his. The Exterminating Angel is one of my favorite films.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I love when he's just in his surrealist peak. He's irreverent to everything, the church, the state, the bourgeoisie. But you're right. The Living Trilogy in particular evokes the 70s Buñuel stuff in the kind of just like situational haze, I guess.
But I don't know if you saw this, but there was an item in the news a couple of years back, and I don't know if anything's going to ever come of it, but Stephen Sondheim licensed The Exterminating Angel and Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie to make a musical about them. So that's a very interesting idea if it ever happens. And it's very Sondheim to think about, the repetitions and the way that the characters are stuck in this cycle that would make that a very interesting musical. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but when I saw that a couple of years ago, I freaked out. So.
He also reminds me of this Finnish filmmaker, Aki Kaurismäki, who's kind of more of a contemporary with Roy Andersson. And there's something about that region. I know I'm generalizing, but something about that Northern European region that has a really distinct voice, especially a distinct comedic voice.
Yes, I agree. And there's some odd semi-surrealistic events. There's one called A Bothersome Man that's from that region also that I think is an excellent film. There's a film about a concert pianist who gets trapped in a city block and no one can leave that city block. And it's these surreal elements about the human condition, which is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, it's weird to consider the legacy of Swedish cinema because it's so heavily tied into one man. I mean, Ingmar Bergman internationally is the name associated with that country's films. But I think it looks super different in the 21st century. There's a palette that always seems to come with those movies. I mean, Roy Andersson's films, all three of these in particular, have this like mustardy, light gray aesthetic.
Well, it's interesting you bring him up because I think he's also the opposite of Roy Andersson in another way, which Andersson has his characters. I think there's a lot of emotion in what they're doing, but they show very little emotion. They seem to just stand there and say the words, whereas Bergman films seem to be so full of pathos and like great, difficult emotions. You think of the scene in Cries and Whispers where the woman cuts herself with a broken wine glass in her private so that she doesn't have to have sex with her husband. And it's so like unsettling and scary and upsetting. And Roy Andersson does the exact opposite. He lets people who look dull and washed out and they almost have white face and they just seem to stand there and say their words almost like they're ghosts, like they're not really present in the film. You know what I mean? They're almost ghosts of what people actually are. It's one of the things I really took from watching this film for like the fourth time today or fifth time.
I agree with that. Although I will say that the two are similar in that a lot of their characters kind of build up this stoicism and then it breaks. And it breaks in different ways. I mean, in Pigeon, there's this sequence at the end of the film after what is mostly funny scenes. But then there's this scene with all these African slaves being led into a huge chamber to be murdered by these Englishmen. It's so jarring after just expecting like another kind of weird, absurdist vignette.
I was reading something about it yesterday because I wanted to be able to speak about that scene. What they do is they march them into this giant cylinder with like what look like trumpet holes, trumpets coming out of them, and then they light a fire underneath. And the only way that these people can not burn to death is to continue moving this cylinder. So, one of the things I read was saying what they were doing was forcing them to make this musical instrument work. That they weren't trying to kill them, but they were torturing them to make this, so that and then you see a shot of all the rich people coming out to watch it, basically. And it's very interesting because I don't know if you ever saw his short film, World of Glory, and it has a very similar kind of very dark scene in it where people just stand by where this horrific incident happens and people just watch it. Again, there's a disconnect, much like I just said about how people are like ghosts in the films. There's this disconnect of emotion for these characters. It's very interesting. I'm assuming a lot of it has to do with culturally the way the Swedish people are, the way they live and their stoicism, but it's a very challenging scene, that scene you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I just watched watched that scene in World of Glory in preparation. And yeah, so basically in that scene, there's a bunch of naked people who are pressed into this truck, and then they're basically just smoked in like a gas chamber. It seems to be some kind of lingering World War II thing to me. I mean, it seems really evocative of concentration camps.
It certainly was a world of glory. I agree completely. And with the scene in Pigeon, I think it certainly was about imperialism, about the imperialist Europe and how they treated Africa and how they treated quote unquote third world areas. It's interesting because one of the things, this is kind of a random connection to that, but one of the things that happens throughout the film Pigeon is we keep seeing characters on the telephone saying, "I'm happy to hear that you're doing well," I think is what they say, something like that. And they say the same line, and they seem very disconnected from the emotion of the person on the other side. They also seem disconnected from what's going on for themselves. There's one industrialist where he's painting of a hawk attacking a bird. So you see him as obviously a predatory person, but he's got a gun in his hand, and you assume maybe he's about to commit suicide when this phone call comes. He's standing there with his gun by his side.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I'm pretty sure I'm happy to hear you're doing fine. It's there's still a tone of severity in it, right? It can't be a well. It has to be still a little repressed. Like,
yeah, and it just seems ingenuine at every turn. Towards the end of the film, there's that bar keeps showing up in the film. We see the two novelty salesmen sitting there having a problem. We see this old man there that they kind of cut back to a scene during World War II again, and then cut to this old man. And I assume that old man might be the man in the foreground of the scene in the past. There's so many little incidents that it's easy to disregard any of them. Again, the characters look disheveled, overweight, badly dressed. They seem to have a white makeup on their face, like they're like as though they've just walked through ashes. And again, that connects to your thing about the Holocaust. But there's one scene where these two little girls are on the balcony blowing soap bubbles. They don't look ashen. They don't look unhappy. They look joyous. And it's really interesting. There's some threads there that I'm still trying to figure out how I want to connect them, but I found it very moving for me.
I agree. I mean, I don't know, with the bar scenes that you mentioned in particular, I was reading this IndieWire interview with Anderson, and he talked about Edward Hopper a lot, and it really made sense to me, especially with like Nighthawks, but really any of his paintings. They have that same kind of like emptiness. Like there's always like a few people in the frame for Anderson or in the painting for Hopper. And yeah, I mean, I think it has to do a lot with loneliness. Like there's a lot of loneliness in this trilogy. I mean, maybe that's the reason it's called the Living Trilogy, because it isn't like something that feels like it's breathing. It actually feels super austere and stuck almost. Then again, I mean, maybe that is more of a realistic depiction of life and less of a cinematic one. There's something that I found really existential about these films, especially the first time I watched them. Just like the occupation of a room and like having to deal with the present. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And in fact, I'm glad you went back to Edward Hopper. One of the things I had read was Roy Anderson referred to The Hunters in the Snow by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and that painting. And it's a painting which everybody's probably seen, which has a bunch of men returning from a hunt. It looks like they're failed. They only have one rabbit hanging over the guy's shoulder. The dogs are bent over. You don't see the faces of these men. And way off in the distance, you see all these rich people ice skating. And I can see, and in fact, there's also, again, birds on a barren tree staring down on all of this. And I think that's where he got the idea that pigeon sat on a branch reflecting an existence. You see the workers who are suffering. You see the rich that don't pay any attention. This disconnected from humanity again. But, you're right. The empty space of Hopper, the characters that seem to be staring out a window, and that loneliness, and yet it's somehow we connect a story to what we see in that painting. And I think Anderson's films work very much that way, where you have a character who sometimes just stands there for 20 seconds and you have to take in the whole frame. The camera doesn't move with him. And that's, for some people, that's very unsettling at first till they get used to what it is. But it's designed so you have time to look at the frame the same way you'd look at a painting,
Exactly. I was thinking about that too. And I mean, usually it feels pretentious to draw parallels between paintings and films, but because of his compositions consistently being, no camera movement, it's just stuck in some weird corner in a room. The takes are incredibly long.
He uses, like, I guess, a deep focus technique where you can see everything, both what's near and what's very far away. And there's always some character that pokes their head in or says, what's going on? Or sort of observes what's happening in our foreground. I think the stationary camera allows us to look around the frame and take in what we want to take in and absorb it in a way that we really experience more actively. We have to participate.
So your stinker was Yesterday.
Yeah. I am of the generation and age where I grew up with the Beatles. I mean, I literally was in grammar school when the Beatles hit, and they are very important to my life. I don't want to get too into my history and my background, but I'm a musician. I went to Berklee College of Music, but the Beatles are core to who I am. I probably know more Beatle trivia than any 10 people put together. I've read every Beatle biography, every book. I mean, I'm obsessed with them. So part of me said, I don't want to see this. It's going to be terrible. And part of me said, I have to see this because people are talking about it. So it came on cable and I managed to sit through it. And there are a couple of charming ideas behind it. There are a couple of nice moments that are sort of sweet. But man, talk about a film that manipulates you. Here he's got the friend that falls in love with him when they're kids. And by the way, that's another problem. She falls in love with him while he's singing an Oasis song. And yet later in the film, Oasis didn't exist at all. So how could she still be in love with him in the new version of Time? That's a whole nother issue. But she falls in love with him. But as an adult, she never tells him she's in love with him. He's so freaking clueless. He doesn't understand that he's in love with her or that she's in love with him. He's obsessed with becoming a pop artist, and yet he's willing to steal from the Beatles because he knows nobody knows who they are. Kate McKenna plays this wonderfully evil record industry person, but she's such a cartoon character that you don't believe a minute of it. I just didn't believe the story from top to bottom at all.
First of all, it postures itself as like kind of a crusade against normies and normieism, if that makes sense. There's the whole idea, the whole conceit is that nobody knows who the Beatles are. And there's this line when he's playing Yesterday and someone says, oh, it's not Coldplay. It's not their song Fix You. And it's like, okay, like, are you making fun of Coldplay or are you part of the group of people that's putting them on a pedestal? Because you literally have Ed Sheeran as a supporting actor in your film. Also, his room, like, oh my God, talk about like entry-level movie posters. He's got Jaws, E.T., and Jurassic Park. That might be a minor thing to dwell on, but it's like whoever did the decoration, like down to the set design, this movie is shitty. And for people who don't really have that broad of a cultural awareness, as snobby as that might sound, I mean, this is a movie for people who don't know that much about the Beatles, which is why a completionist like you might be really peeved. Even someone like me, who's a moderately big Beatles fan, every time they're singing a Beatles song, it's like, what's the purpose of this? To like remind the viewers that they know that jingle? Oh, wow. I know that one. Like, what's going on?
The premise doesn't work. His giving the music to the world, what is that? Is streaming a good thing? Is that what we're telling everybody? Giving free music is what we want to do? That no one has any value anymore? I mean, I understand it wasn't his music and that's why he gave it away, but that doesn't ring true either to me, you know?
No, it's even worse. It's even worse than them saying that streaming is a good thing. It seemingly shows a lack of awareness of how music is accessed nowadays. Because the idea in that scene, right? He's at this concert and he finally reveals that he has been saying that the Beatles music was his, blah, blah, blah. And then the crowd starts cheering because he releases all the music to them for free. Yeah, that's how we listen to music nowadays. How were they going to listen to it otherwise? Were they going to go buy it on vinyl? Like, were they going to get a cassette? Like, I don't understand. There's this weird, like, detached quality to this.
You know, I hate to say it, but a lot of commercial films, I have a friend who's a dear friend of mine, she's an attorney in the entertainment business, mainly representing screenwriters. And she said, you can't imagine how bad all these committee decisions are, how everything ends up with a bunch of people sitting around a table making a committee decision. That sounded like a committee decision movie to me. That wasn't an auteur saying, I have this vision. I mean, as great a director as he is, Slumdog Millionaire is a great film in a lot of ways. But this is terrible. This was unbearable.
Can we talk about Ed Sheeran?
Yeah, sure.
There is just so much Ed Sheeran that this film drowns you in. I mean, I despise Ed Sheeran, but I hated him even more after I saw this. There's this line that he has where he's talking to the guy. I don't even remember his name. I didn't bother committing it to memory. The protagonist. That's how much I resented this film. I guess I'm trying to dissociate from it. And I watched it yesterday. Okay, basically the situation is that Ed Sheeran challenges this Beatles imposter to a song write-off. And they're supposed to go in some secluded room and both of them get 10 minutes and they come back and they play a song. All right, first of all, nobody involved with this project has ever written a song before.
Exactly.
Complaint number one. Complaint number two, they return and Ed Sheeran plays this polished song that sounds horrible because it's him. You know, everyone oohs and ahs. And then the guy comes back and he I don't remember which Beatles song he plays. It blurs after a while because it's just, it can never be a deep cut, by the way. It has to be a Beatles song that everybody with only a peripheral awareness to the Beatles would know. So he plays one of those and Ed Sheeran goes up and he says, I was always told there'd be someone who came along who'd be a lot better than me. Yeah, no fucking kidding, Ed Sheeran. The Beatles are better than you. Like the immense arrogance of that line. It's almost incomprehensible.
Well, I suppose you're supposed to, as an audience, see him as winking and grinning at you, you know, like everything's ironic. But there's a point at which that irony, there's a scene where this guy writes, "Hey Jude," and Ed Sheeran is producing it and says, "Hey, you should change it to Hey Dude." And it's like, it is the stupidest thing to say. So I suppose you're supposed to think all along that Ed Sheeran's in on the joke, so to speak, but it's still cringeworthy at every step of the way.
There's another scene like the Hey Dude where he gets a phone call and Shape of You is his ringtone. So it's clearly supposed to be an arrogant parody caricature of himself, but to me that's just who he is.
If you haven't seen Yesterday, don't see it. Let me say that.
There's the scene where Ed Sheeran first shows up and he knocks on his door. I was just thinking about if I opened my door and Ed Sheeran was in front, it would be a get off my property type of conversation. So what Beatles movies would you recommend?
Well, obviously, A Hard Day's Night. I mean, come on. This is a masterpiece. This is a brilliant masterpiece, A Hard Day's Night. It's one of the greatest films, regardless of the Beatles being in it. I think it's a great film. I did enjoy Backbeat quite a bit. I did enjoy Nowhere Boy quite a bit. There's a couple of films that you can only find on YouTube or something. There's a short TV film that was based on a play, which is kind of you talk about this premise of Yesterday. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a play called Snodgrass, and the premise is that John Lennon quit the Beatles early on. And then you see him as an adult looking back with his frustration and his working class life. And I forget the name of the actor. It's the same actor that played him much younger in Backbeat.
I just wanted to talk about your resounding enthusiasm for A Hard Day's Night, because I assume as a huge Beatles fan, it's just great to see so much of them. You just see them doing their thing. I mean, and they're not in concert and they're having, even though they're contrived film conversations, you see them just talking casually. But I think there's some problems with that movie. I'll dispute your
okay.
It's as good as it is, because I really, to me, Paul's uncle character, it just doesn't work.
It's comic relief, yeah.
And the comic relief is already in those Beatles movies with Ringo, because Ringo, I think, is discernibly the best actor of the four, because he's funny and he knows how to emote, whereas the rest are, they're charming, but they're kind of flat in front of the camera.
Yes, it's a character of their personalities, but I think he captured the essence of a lot of their personalities very well. I think the wordplay and clever ways they interact is really good. You think about rock and roll exploitation films of the 50s and early 60s, they were really horrible. And the Beatles film is well put together. It's smart. There's cultural stuff like the old man in the train that says, "I've been running this train for 40 years." I think it's a lot of fun. Well,
I appreciate you hopping on Thinker Stinker, and thanks for talking, Mark.
Yeah, before we finish up, I just want to say, again, like you pointed out, a lot of Roy Anderson's films are hard to find, but people should definitely go on YouTube and check out his commercials. They're hysterical. They're brilliant. They're just amazing. His short film that we mentioned before, World of Glory, I believe you can find on there as well. You could definitely stream Pigeon Sat on a Branch on several different resources right now. And if you can't get access to You the Living, a lot of library systems have them available. So if you have a county-wide library system, you might be able to get the DVD that way. They are really, I agree with you. I think You the Living is my favorite of the three. And I only picked Pigeon because I knew people could actually see it. And if we talked about, You the Living, you and I might be the only ones to be able to see it for this next 6 months. So.
Thanks, Mark.